Now we've got the world's attention. We must organize and outline our demands. Before anything else, we must decide exactly what we're fighting for.
And so when we get through the civil rights movement, they asked them, so blacks, what do y'all want? What are you marching for? What do you want? And our civil rights leaders incompetently said, we want something that we can't measure. We want equal opportunity. And so the white community says, abracadabra, you got it. What else do y'all want? They say, well, we want equality. They say, abracadabra, you got it. They said, well, what else do you want? We want freedom. They said, abracadabra, you got it. Now get the hell out of here and don't come back anymore. They didn't get anything. The civil rights movement got nothing. And every time they got a march, they're marching to Washington, you can ask them, what is it that you're marching for?
Black people will no longer accept sympathy payments. We demand economic liberation. But we also need to be clear about who we are fighting for. Marcus Garvey fought for all people of African descent. Elijah Muhammad fought for African American Muslims. Malcolm X fought for black Muslims. And then for all black people worldwide. Martin Luther King Jr. fought for African Americans. Dr. Claude Anderson fights for American descendants of slaves. Dr. Umar Johnson fights for all black people of African descent. Once it's decided what and who we are fighting for, we split, but not out of spite. There's limited good in having numbers without strength. Results and impact will also be limited. Lastly, the message and focus of the group will be diluted. Do not exert energy fighting other groups with the same overarching goal to uplift black people. This is counterintuitive and counterproductive. Let the people decide which group most aligns with their values and beliefs. All focus should be on black liberation. Same game, different leagues. Just as you have with any team sport, we must learn to peacefully coexist.
And the other side of it too, one of the big hindrance, Brother DJ Envy, for our unity is that we have a misunderstood word. We say we want to unite, but in our mind, we're not thinking unity, we're thinking uniformity. And there's a difference between unity and uniformity. See, uniformity means everybody does the same thing in the same way and looks the same while they're doing it. But unity means you do different things at different places, but for one common cause. We will never have uniformity. Breaking news, everybody's not going to be a member of your church. Everybody's not going to be a part of your denomination. Everybody's not going to join your fraternity. Some people going to do different things in a different way. That's uniform. We need unity.
That's right.
Which means we do different things in a different place at a different time. And that's the way that God made the body. There's a verse in the Quran says, surely there's a message in creation for those who believe. Look how he created us in the best of modes. Inside the body, this is not a sign of uniformity, it's a unity. You got different organs that look different, do different things at a different place at a different time, but for the survival of this one organism. Well, what would happen if our organizations work like that? Organizations. Everybody did so you be NAACP, be the liver if that's your job. Urban League, be the kidney if that's your job. Be the heart, be the whatever you are, play your role and let us do what we can do in unity for the survival of us as a people.
An 8-step plan to black liberation. Number 1, level up in your knowledge of our history.
And I'm going to start out first by telling you this. You cannot solve a problem. You can solve no problems on this earth unless you first of all understand the history of the problem. The first thing you do as a doctor, when a patient comes into your office, say, what is the history of the problem? Is it peculiar to your family or to your group or to your race?
Study our history in order to identify root causes, past mistakes, and successes which you can learn from. Black people have been intentionally told to move on, without having the issues of the past appropriately addressed. In order to move forward, you must first go back and contextualize your problems.
West Africa was often the source of forced and kidnapped laborers because of its proximity to seaports, which made contact between these three locations more possible. Also, laborers from West African countries were more familiar with the agricultural methods needed for mass cultivation of these kinds of crops in the New World. So, how does it all add up? Well, even though the slave trade brought an estimated 9 to 12 million people here from Africa as cargo, colonists eventually resorted to reproduction within the colonies as a method for sustaining slavery. This meant that slavery could be passed down as an inherited status from mother to child. And to justify this never-ending enslavement, we started to see the evolution of false race science and racialization used as a justification for why one group of people, specifically people of African descent, were the only ones who could be enslaved. But this shift erased the reality that prior to turning to West Africa as a labor source, slavery existed across racial lines and was dictated more by battles and military capture than by skin tone. The resulting idea we had about race evolved out of a desire by people engaging in the slave trade to find an after-the-fact justification for enslaving people from one specific region over others.
History is usually written by the winners, not by the losers. And the way in which the history of slavery has been represented, for the most part, is as abolition, the triumph of abolition. So we're trying to think again about that way of writing the history and put the whole slavery business and the wealth it produced and the people who were involved in it back into British history. If you read what we call against the grain of some of these histories, you can find the mediated voices of the enslaved. So an interesting example of this would be the way in which a very famous narrative of a black enslaved woman, Mary Prince, was produced by the abolitionists as a form of propaganda in 1831. This woman was living for some of this time in the area absolutely around Bloomsbury, where her owner, John Adams Wood, had a house. Although it's apparently in her voice telling her history, she tells it to a woman who transcribes it, and it's then edited by the Secretary of the Anti-Slavery Society. So it's made appropriate for an abolitionist audience. It's a particular way of telling the narrative, which can give us some access to the experience of the enslaved woman, but only some. We can't take it as simply authentic, that this is what Mary Prince said or thought. Trying to read between the lines is a very important way of trying to get access to black people's experience. But this is work that it's very, very important to do, and particularly important for women since, they're even less recorded. In 1833, when slavery was abolished in the British Caribbean and in Mauritius and the Cape, £20 million was paid in compensation to the slave owners because they were seen as having lost what was called their property, the enslaved men and women who they had bought or who had been born in captivity on their estates. And of that £20 million, which was paid out of taxpayers' money, nearly 10 million stayed in Britain. So there were a very substantial number of slave owners in Britain who made substantial claims on that money and therefore had a large cash influx at that time. The poet Elizabeth Barrett, who became Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was the daughter of a very significant Jamaican slave owner, and she had very, very complicated feelings about slavery and slave ownership, and she was not sympathetic to slavery, but she was very well aware that the family money came from slavery, and indeed she inherited money on that basis. And she wrote a poem in the 1840s, which she wrote, in fact, for the American abolitionists, called The Runaway Slave at Pilgrim's Point. And in that poem, she tries to imagine being black. So there are many powerful lines in the poem, in the voice of an enslaved woman, "I am black, I am black." And this is a woman who is raped by her white master, bears a child, cannot bear the fact that her child is the product of rape, kills the child, and calls on the enslaved to rebel. So it's a very, very dramatic poem. Yet this woman, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who imagines all this, her own life is made comfortable financially by her family wealth. And she was not opposed at all to the principle of compensation. She thought that it was right that the slave owners were compensated because property was property, and if you lose property, it should be compensated. So that just gives us one of those complicated glimpses into what it meant to be totally implicated in the slavery business and yet to have very ambivalent feelings about it. It's been hard for Britons to think about the extent to which slavery has shaped our history. And there are many physical remnants of that, the country houses that were built on slaving wealth, the art collections that were accumulated by slave owners, the ways in which sugar became an absolutely central part of the diet of the entire British population from the 18th century onwards, the ways in which British financial and commercial institutions have actually been built on Atlantic slave trade and slavery. And of course that's a long time ago, but those are the roots. And then there's the political legacies and the kinds of hierarchies of racism, the ways in which contemporary racial thought has many inflections from this long, long history. It's those legacies that we're pursuing through the 19th century, through our work on the compensation records. And where we want people to think about that because of the present, and the ways in which these formations have been part of what it is to be.
Lagos, now a full British colony, Portuguese influence in the region dissipated and Lagos became a commercial hub for the export of palm oil and other raw materials sourced from the surrounding regions. Following the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884, the map of modern Nigeria was outlined for further exploration and conquest, and Sir George Tolman Godey's Royal Niger Company was authorized to secure the territory. Recruiting and enlisting many local militias to its cause, the Royal Niger Company embarked on a campaign to conquer the territory, and within just over a decade, it had forcefully secured over 400 treaties from various local rulers, pledging their allegiance and granting full legislative and judicial authority to the company. After having established itself as the de facto government of a region encompassing over 250 ethnic groups and over 400 languages, the Royal Niger Company officially transferred control of Nigeria to the British government on the 1st of January 1900, receiving £865,000 as compensation. Just as a side note, the Royal Niger Company still exists today as part of Unilever plc, the company behind popular brands like Ben & Jerry's, Lipton, Dove and Vaseline. Recognizing the vast differences between the people in the region, the British initially divided the new territory into a southern Nigerian protectorate, which had become majority Christian, and a northern Nigerian protectorate, which had remained majority Muslim. However, while southern Nigeria was very productive and ran at a budget surplus due to its abundant natural resources and its people's embrace of education and commerce, the north was a largely loss-making enterprise that cost the British more to administer than they gained in the trade of its raw materials. It has been suggested that the financial woes of the Northern Protectorate was due to a combination of its relatively fewer natural resources and the strong Islamic culture in the region, which was very resistant to secular education. Needing an urgent solution to the Northern Nigerian budget deficit, British High Commissioner Frederick Lugard decided that it would be a great idea to join the two vastly different regions together into one united political entity. And to the dismay of many protesting southern Nigerians, the two protectorates were amalgamated in 1914 to form a single British colony of Nigeria, which would ultimately become the Federal Republic of Nigeria we know today. As another side note, many scholars believe that it was Lugard's wife, Flora Shaw, who named the country Nigeria after the river Niger that runs across the territory. So in more ways than one, Nigeria was never a very Nigerian idea to begin with. Rather than being some kind of mythical homeland of the Nigerian people, a more accurate description based solely on its origin story would be to describe it as a corporate entity that was formed to ensure the profitable exploitation of the natural resources in the geographical areas that surround the Niger River. And nearly 60 years after gaining independence from British rule in 1960, my country Nigeria still seems to conform to the original purpose for which it was formed. The only difference now is that rather than lining the pockets of the shareholders of the Royal Niger Company, its resources now line the pockets of the Nigerian elite. Having discovered over 37 billion barrels of oil reserves under its soil, modern-day Nigeria may have ditched palm oil for the more profitable crude oil, but the status quo remains very much the same. The only Nigerians that seem to benefit from the country's natural wealth are the elites that own oil wells and the government officials tasked with managing the resource. Despite a failing education system, poor infrastructure, insecurity, and mass unemployment, Nigerian politicians are arguably some of the best paid politicians in the world. A recent report by Nigerian news station Channels TV estimated that Nigerian senators earn as much as $80,000 a month in wages and allowances, meaning that they are paid over 10,000 times more than the Nigerian minimum wage and over 200 times more than its GDP per capita. All this in a country where nearly 87 million people live on less than $1 a day. Indeed, life for the average Nigerian has become so hard that the goal for many is to live anywhere else but Nigeria. To draw a shocking comparison, while an estimated 10.5 million African slaves were involuntarily taken out of Africa over the 300 years of the transatlantic slave trade, some estimates suggest that the number of Nigerians voluntarily living outside of Nigeria has grown to over 15 million since its independence in 1960. From popular destinations like the US, UK, and Canada to places like Russia, Ukraine, and Malaysia, Nigerians are choosing to endure all kinds of prejudice, climates, and harsh treatment just to make a better life for themselves and their families. Just like the Royal Niger Company and its pre-independence colonial administrators ran Nigeria primarily for the benefit of themselves and the British Empire, in many ways, the current generation of Nigerian elites do exactly the same, but perhaps to a much more extreme degree.
Belgium experienced great industrial development and colonial expansion during Leopold's reign, and he is mainly remembered as the founder and sole owner of the Congo Free State. The brutal exploitation of the Congolese population in his pursuit of resources like ivory and rubber are infamous. The king believed that without a colony, a country could never achieve any historical significance. And in addition to that, he believed a colony would have great economic possibilities and could help spread Western civilization. Underneath this, as a constitutional monarch, Leopold II had no real power in Belgium, so it could offer him a way to gain more power and enrich himself. However, his government disagreed with him. They considered colonialism to be anachronistic and were therefore not interested in pursuing his colonial dreams. The king knew he couldn't count on their support and had to think of another way. His eyes were set on the Congo in sub-Saharan Africa, which was largely unexplored in the mid-19th century and was mostly unclaimed by European countries, except for the coastal areas. King Leopold II developed a new strategy to obtain the Congo. In 1876, he helped organize a geographical conference in Brussels so that his operations would be legitimized. There, he proposed the creation of a holding company named the Association Internationale Africaine, later known as the Comité d'études pour le Congo, and finally as the Association Internationale du Congo from 1879. The AIA would provide a front for his colonial activities. That way, he would have a recognized and philanthropic platform. As its mission, Leopold pledged to suppress the East African slave trade, guarantee free trade with the colony, and promote humanitarian policies. This was to distract critics and justify Leopold's ambition on the Congo. In 1878, the king found a journalist and explorer who also saw great economic possibilities in Africa, named Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley had been to the Congo between 1874 and 1877. The king decided to hire him to survey the Congo River area in 1879. Stanley was to build roads and bridges, establish posts along the navigable river, and he had to make treaties with the Congolese chiefs. His exploration was under the guise of Leopold's holding company, which was devoted to free trade and the suppression of the slave trade. Stanley returned in 1882 and had concluded treaties with over 500 chiefs. These chiefs did not have a true idea of what they had signed and only received a few yards of cloth or a few trinkets in exchange for putting their marks on his mysterious papers, and thus accepting the flag of the Congo Association.
In the 1870s, the land around the little town of Kimberley, in what is now South Africa, was found to contain the richest deposits of diamonds in the world. Europeans in search of quick and easy profits rushed into the area. Among them was a young Englishman who'd come to South Africa at the age of 17. His name was Cecil Rhodes. In spite of his youth, Rhodes quickly learned that the path to great personal wealth led through great personal power. He set out to win that power by getting control of the diamond industry. He succeeded by clever maneuvering, the steady purchase of other men's claims when their funds were low, and the necessary ruthlessness. Rhodes saw to it that he was going to be the one to emerge as the king of diamonds. And his kingdom was going to be in Africa, where the English reigned supreme. This is what he wrote.
Just fancy those parts of the world that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence.
This early film, taken in Kimberley, shows that attitude of arrogance at work. Yet mineral wealth was not the only prize. There was territory to be won. All through the 19th century, British forces pushed out of Cape Colony, overcoming one African people after another, until in 1879 they came up against the most formidable of all, the
Second World War. There was an uprising by the Kikuyu people who wanted their land back. The Kikuyu were herded into concentration camps and fortified villages, almost the entire population of over 1 million people. People were systematically tortured to death. They invented a new kind of pliers whose purpose was first to crush men's testicles and then to cut them off. They raped women with bayonets. They raped men. Similarly, a favoured technique was to ram sand up the rectum with a stick. Sometimes they were rolled up in barbed wire and kicked around the compound until they bled to death. Some of the British soldiers boasted about this. This is within living memory. The colonial secretary lied about it. The papers documenting it were burnt. The impact of the rich and powerful nations has been so phenomenally murderous and destructive that it has been completely airbrushed from our national consciousness. In order to justify the land-grabbing colonial projects, you had to create an ideology. We, the Europeans or the Americans, have come to rescue the rest of the world from its depravity and backwardness. But in order to do that, you have to be able to demonstrate that the rest of the world is depraved and backward. From this arose the racism that is still with us today. It was a necessary component of the colonial project. Some people might claim, well, okay, we broke a few eggs to make this omelette. It's as if all those human beings were eggs. But look at the omelette. Isn't it fantastic? Look, we've made this fantastic omelette. Forget about all that unpleasant stuff and let's just celebrate where we are. Where we are is a continuation of the project. We commodified people's land and people's labour and turned it into our property. We're also destroying the rest of the living world alongside it. We don't have to be like this. We are the same human beings as anybody else. We're all part of the same big human family. We just have to recognise that, accept that. And of course, within Western countries, there are plenty of brilliant people resisting colonisation, both internal colonisation within our own countries and external colonisation of other people's countries.
Why was Muammar Gaddafi killed? Muammar Gaddafi was murdered because he, along with the other African heads of state, were about to bring into existence Africa's first central bank. They were erecting a central bank in Africa, which was going to do what? Back its money to the resources under the ground in Africa. Now, what would that have done to the global economic order? Remember, the United States dollar isn't backed on any natural resource. The British pound isn't backed on any natural resource. The Canadian dollar, the European Union, their currency isn't backed on any natural resource because Europe doesn't have a lot of natural resources. Africa does. So if they would have been successful in creating a central bank of Africa, coming up with a unitary currency, and then backing that currency to the material wealth under the soil, they would have bankrupted every other economic system in this world from America to Europe to China. That was revolution, and that's why Muammar Gaddafi had to be assassinated, because he was about to help the African heads of state eliminate modern slavery and neocolonialism from the continent.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
And our resolve is clear. The people of Libya must be protected.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli?
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this, one in 96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organized by Gaddafi. And everybody was interested. I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro. A gold dinar would have had serious consequences for the world financial system, but may also have empowered the people of Africa, something black activists say the US wants to avoid at all costs.
Number 2, make note of any issues black people have historically faced and obstacles black people face today. Number 3, identify some reasons why each of these problems and obstacles exist. Here's a few examples. Gang culture. In any community where opportunities are limited, people will seek alternative means for survival.
As a gangbanger, right, when you go on a mission, you might, when you're looking for your so-called enemy, you driving through a different hood down the street. You know, it's an invisible line. You cross this street, now you in another hood. And you hunting. And when you looking, you going to pass up the dude that's dressed square, right? You're going to pass up a dude from a different race. When you see somebody that's dressed like you dress and got the walk like you got and got the body language like you, you're going to say, there you go, get him. And that's deep. Whew. You know what I'm saying? When you really unpack that.
That's crazy.
You know what I'm saying? You looking for yourself just on the other side of town. And you're going to hop out and attack him and try to down him in a real way. And being caught up in gangbanging culture, you don't think that deep. You just think of, these niggas came through and shot the hood up. We about to go back through there and return the favor. But as you really mature, as I matured and you know, became exposed to other opportunities and embraced them, had to be honest with myself. I started being honest and thinking about it like, damn, you know, just the selection process.
We lack wealth. That's because we do not own and control much.
South Africa with something like about 29 million blacks as an example, as a comparative example. 29 million blacks in South Africa. You got a little over 2 million whites. But guess what? They own almost 100% of all the wealth in Africa, the 2 million whites. As a matter of fact, in Africa, the De Beers family, one white family, the De Beers family, owns over 50% of the whole wealth of Africa. That means all the gold, silver, chrome, bauxite, magnesium, land, property, everything. And you want to know why they can't make it in Africa? They don't own and control anything. And so in America, if we're going to be a competitive group, we got to go back to what is the basic problem we can deal with. The biggest problem with blacks right now, they own no wealth. They control absolutely nothing. Not in the United States, not in Grand Rapids. I don't have to go around Grand Rapids find what you got. I can guarantee you right now what you have and don't have. Or when you go into any city, you figure out who owns the buildings, the big buildings, who owns the communication system, who owns the banks, who owns the railroads, the bus companies. That's where your power is. If you don't control a sufficient amount of that, you are a guest, G-U-E-S-T. You have no power. They can do anything they want anytime you want them. So black folk don't have enough wealth to be a competitive group. You cannot compete. That's the first problem.
We're divided. That's because this is a power strategy used against us.
Blacks never got in the land. So what we're going to do now to play the game, play the game to answer your question. We got to go for resources. But the two things that are hurting us, we don't have any resources because they stole that. The second thing you don't have is they stole your social cohesiveness.
You mean as far as like unity and group operation?
That's right. That's
okay.
Right. They did not allow you to play the game, to be together, come together. That was a threat. It's intimidating. It was intimidating during slavery. It's intimidating right now for black folks to start talking about coming together.
We don't support existing black enterprise. That's because we lack commitment, direction, and focus.
We're going to go and start doing something for black folk, not to hurt anybody else. Now, how do you do it? You go back to the basic problem, which is lack of wealth. Now, black folk got almost getting close to about $1 trillion in wealth now. $1 million in wealth. $1 billion in wealth. What you need to do now, what you have to do is to figure out how to tap that money and hold it. Black folk right now, annual disposable income makes up about the 9th richest nation on earth. But the reason black folk are so impoverished and poor in this city and all these other cities, they don't practice group economics. They can't practice group economics. Why? Because they don't have communities. Integration destroyed their communities. Now, when I go across America, I go to every city, and I cannot find not one single black community in America. All you got in America are black neighborhoods. A black neighborhood is totally, absolutely useless. A black neighborhood is where you eat and sleep. The Holiday Inn, the Marriott, is a neighborhood. You don't have any black communities. Not one black community in America. To have a black community, you must qualify with 3 things you must have. You must have a wholly independent economic structure. You must have a code of conduct. You must have people in elected office to represent you. They have to be qualified as a community. I go across America, I can't find one. I get into California, I can find Chinatown, Japan towns, little Cambodia, little Saigon, Korea towns, little Mexican towns. I can find little Havanas, Hialeah, Cork town, Pork towns, little Italy's, little Italian, Greek towns. But I can't find a black town any place in the country. If you don't have a community, you can't play the game in real life Monopoly. You cannot practice Monopoly in this town unless you all build a community. You got to build a community. And the community, if you can't build a community, you got to build a sense of a community. And I go up to Philadelphia and talk to my Italian friends. All of it don't live in Little Italy anymore. They identify with Little Italy and come down and support it and buy from it in stores and businesses. Now, all the other groups, they do that naturally and instinctively. You got to set up this town right now, and I want the Chamber of Commerce to start doing this, to get all their organizations to learn how to start training black kids how to produce wealth. It is wealth that determines your equal opportunities. Your wealth determines where you can go and where you can't go. Civil rights and socialism gets you nothing.
Our music glorifies our problems. That's because musicians see their music as a means to an end.
You get artists who say, it's not my responsibility to be responsible with my content. I'm not the reason we have murders. I'm not the reason young brothers in the UK are killing each other. I'm not the reason children are dropping out of school. You may not be the reason. That's correct. But your music influences the behavior of the people who listen to it. No, you didn't create violence, but you can motivate more violence, and you can advertise violence by glamorizing it in your music. See, the artist has a very critical responsibility in our community. Their job is to, yes, tell their experience. I'm talking about violence because I lived through violence. I talk about jail because I went to jail. I understand. But the artist not only has a responsibility to reflect experience, the artist also has a responsibility to project a new reality. And although I see a lot of our artists here in the UK reflecting their experience, I don't see them necessarily projecting a new reality. And that's where I would criticize the UK artists. Don't just tell me what we're going through. Tell me where we need to go.
Number 4. Assess some potential solutions for each issue you have identified. Number 5. Identify the resources that we presently have and resources that we lack.
There's 4 institutions that you must have in order to be considered an independent community. We don't have them nowhere in space and time at the same time. A hospital to protect African life. A supermarket, okay, for nutrition to preserve African life. Education to prepare the next generation of African children for the role that they must play in the freedom struggle. And number 4, a bank to finance the building of infrastructure and institutions and organizations and programs where we live. You cannot find those 4 things totally owned by African people anywhere on the face of the earth, but we will call ourselves free. There's 2 types of freedom. There's a FREEDOM and there's an FREEDUMB. White people have the freedom. We have the freedom because we're too politically uneducated to recognize that it doesn't matter if you can drive a Mercedes. It doesn't matter if you can live in a white suburb. It doesn't matter if your black child can go to a white school. At the end of the day, what do you control? What do you own? What do you produce? What do you distribute?
Social integration is a diluting process. It's a watering down process. And before integration, black people in America had their own businesses. They had their own communities. They had their own schools and churches. They had as a matter of fact, in the Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where I grew up, my family was one of the families that was a part owner of a 4-family operation. We own the only black bus line in America, the only one they've ever had. When I say a bus line, I'm not talking about 3 or 4 buses or 10 or 15 buses. We had over 500 buses. We didn't service just the black neighborhood. We serviced the white neighborhoods too. It was called a Safe Bus Company in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We took care of the city bus services. In Winston-Salem, the black community also had 2 cab companies. Why? Because the white community had 2 cab companies. The white community had the Bluebird and the yellow cabs. Blacks, we had the Harris cab and the Kansas City cabs. We had our own movie theaters, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. They had theirs, the Hollywood, the North Carolina theaters, the state theaters. We had our own restaurants and shoe shops and clothing stores and everything. We lost all of that. We even had our own movie theaters. We had the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. In every city in the United States, blacks had the 2 movie theaters, the Lincoln and Lafayette theaters. We had movie producing studios, Norman Productions down in Jacksonville, Florida, Rishaw in Chicago, and Hollywood Productions making our own movies. They weren't the best movies, but they were ours. But see, when integration came, it took away everything from us. And unfortunately, it wasn't because it was a conspiracy of whites to do that. It wasn't the whites that did that. It was the NAACP. Now, don't go blaming whites for that. Whites didn't jump up this idea about let's go out and force blacks into integration. You see, when down in McLaren, South Carolina, where I used to live, in McLaren, South Carolina, they filed an original lawsuit that became the desegregation decision in 1954. They weren't filing for social integration. They filed it because the black kids were walking to school every day and the white kids were riding on buses. And in my school, in elementary school, we had to spend the first week every year of school cleaning up the old books. The white schools would send all the old books over to our school. We had to clean them and fix them up and take gum erase and get all the dirt and trash off and put tape on them. We got all that. Here's the problem. that historically in this society, black folk have not moved one iota than where they were in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. In a comparative proportional term, black people are exactly where they were on the eve of the Civil War. And the eve of the Civil War, at that particular time, we had approximately 300,000 black people that were free in this country, or quasi-free, having come out of slavery. And that was out of 5 million black folk. And that 300,000 black people had mysteriously and miraculously accomplished and acquired one half of 1% of this nation's wealth. Now here you are 150 years later, and black people still only have and own 1/2 of 1% of the nation's wealth after 150 years. Almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, businesses, income, and controls of all levels of government. That was the point of slavery. It has never been corrected or addressed. All of a sudden, when black folk came out of slavery in 1865, how did they come out? They came out penniless, poor. No food, no animals, no land, no resources, no tools, no religion, no organization, nothing. All they were told is go out now, you're free, go out and compete. Compete with what? Compete with what? They said, well, you can jump high and run faster. Black folk had nothing coming out of slavery to compete with and to play the game, because you see, slavery has systematically, socially engineered them into the lowest level of a real-life monopoly game. And see, prior to the end of the Civil War, the greatest wealth builder in this nation was the back of a slave. That's what built the wealth of the society. Wall Street was set up and established and regulated off of the price and the value of a slave. Cotton prices, indigo prices, tobacco prices all followed the value of a slave. When slavery ended, the whole process shifted to the back of a slave. At the end of slavery, it shifted to Wall Street. And those became commodities then. And when the wealth building in this nation shifted from the back of a slave to Wall Street, they set up a new game. It was called monopoly.
Number 6. Identify which resources we should build ourselves and which should be demanded.
We got to recognize that wealth is intergenerationally created. Most people who get rich don't get rich in a lifetime. Oprah, that's once in a while. Bill Gates, that's once in a while. Most people are intergenerational wealth. That means what? That if black people want to catch up, we have to start saving wealth and passing it to the next generation. Our biggest problem ain't that we're splurging. Is that every time we splurge, we're stealing from our descendants. You're giving them no inheritance to get started with. But the white child, they're starting out $100,000 plus, $1 million plus. And I think we have to become more strategic in the way that we do our health plans, as well as our life insurance plans. Because what I'm learning with a lot of these white folk, a lot of them are getting their first, what you want to call a shock of wealth, through the life insurance policy of their parents. White folks been already building wealth for a couple centuries. We started behind the 8 ball, okay? So you got to play catch up. How do you catch up with somebody who's 100 yards in front of you? You have to run faster than they are. That means we have to sacrifice our spending habits more than everyone else in order to
start with your economy. Once you build an economy, a viable, competitive economy, by making your money circulate 8 to 12 times, you take that money and you move to the second floor. The second floor is your politicians. Don't worry about voting. You don't have to vote. People that got money, whether it's organized crime or wealthy people, they don't have to vote. You take your money on the first floor and you buy every politician on the second floor. And if you can't buy them, you rent or lease them. And once you rent or lease those politicians or buy them on the second floor, you hold them accountable to go to the third floor. And you stop the police from shooting and killing black folk all the time. And come up with new codes of conduct. Then once you get to the third floor and get the police and court system straight, because you can now effectuate it, then you go to the fourth floor. The fourth floor means media. You cannot own television stations, radio stations, and daily newspapers if you don't have an economy. I hear black folk crying all the time. I have 2 radio stations. I used to have 4. You cannot have a media operation unless you have an economy. Who's going to buy your time, your ads? You got to have an economy to buy the time. And so you got it. Right now we have 12,000 radio stations in the United States. We got about 12,000 cable systems, 5,000 daily newspapers, 5,000 TV stations. Black folk own 35 thousandths of 1%. You can't even communicate. You can't communicate, you can't organize. You can't get communication because you don't have an economy. And once you get enough money, you put your medium up at the fourth floor. Then lastly, you tell the fifth floor, which is a school system, say, here's what we want. We don't want any more black basketball players and football players. Every black right now, a successful black, has got some kind of an illicit relationship with a ball. He's either running with a tennis ball, basketball, golf ball, football, sitting on jokes, telling jokes, pretending he's having a ball. Just get away from that. And say from now on, you try to raise kids that can produce something. The producers will be the people survive. Right now, black folk are zero producers and 100% consumers. You're going to get totally wiped out in this country and wiped off the face of the earth under globalization if you don't learn how to produce.
Why are Western countries still meddling in African affairs?
Because Western countries cannot survive without African resources. One thing about, human existence that we have to understand is, for whatever reason, when God made the world, he made Europe dependent on Africa for resources. That's just the way it goes. And because the wars against colonialism in Africa never completely eradicated the control of the resources. Most African countries, they got a flag and they got an anthem and they got a president. They did not get control of their resources back. I don't care if you're dealing with Anglo Gold in Ghana, South Africa. We don't control the resources. And the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and one of the reasons Barack Obama was made president was to go back into Africa and make the continent safe for Western exploitation. When we stop letting the white man take resources out of Africa for cheap and for free, that's when you know Africa's serious.
Okay.
All groups should rely on a decision-making framework. Number 7. Assess the appropriateness of actions using your decision-making framework. Consider the impact of your future decisions on the overall group. Think about our problems, solutions, resources, and areas where we are lacking. Does my action add to our solutions or our problems? Does it add to our resources or detract from them?
Right now, we have a global situation where a lot of Africans, men and women, are dating outside of their race because they believe we live in a post-racial society. Understand the 4 stages of white supremacy. First, white supremacy establishes itself. White supremacy then maintains itself. White supremacy then expands itself. And then white supremacy refines itself. We are in the stage of refinement. Refinement means that white supremacy has perfected the art of not looking like white supremacy. For example, you see a lot of African men marrying outside of their race all across the world, but they fail to recognize that the woman they're marrying, who's normally a white woman, belongs to the global white supremacist order. So although he's the husband and she's the wife, she still has the power. At any point in that relationship, she could pick up a telephone, accuse him of a particular crime, and regardless of whether he committed it or not, his whole life would be changed. Furthermore, we have to recognize that women live longer than men. So if I, as an African man, marry a European woman or a Chinese woman or an East Indian woman or an Arab woman, whatever wealth I accumulated in my life, when I die, my wealth goes over to the woman of that race. We need that money to build the institutions and industries. So how does a black man with full consciousness who claims to be loyal to his mother and loyal to his people marry a woman who is not in the image of his mother, whom he knows after he dies is going to take his resources and give them to her race, not his? Marrying outside of your race for an African man anywhere on earth is one of the greatest acts of racial betrayal, treason, and treachery. It is absolutely intolerable and disrespectful to black women. With so few black women finding husbands, how do you find it within your soul to marry somebody else's daughter who you know is only eloping with you because you have education, income, economics, privilege, position, or property. These women are not marrying poor black men. They're marrying well-educated black men on purpose. It has nothing to do with love. If it was about love, why can't we find rich East Indian women, rich Chinese women, rich white women marrying poor black men? Why is it always well-educated and stable black men marrying poor white women, Chinese women, or East Indian women? In Africa,
I don't hate white women, but I understand that women live longer than men do. So if I marry a white woman, she's likely to be on this earth longer than I am. And when I die, is she going to give any of my money to the black community? When I die, is she going to give money to a black college? When I die, is she going to put any of our children through college? Michael Jordan just married a white woman who's about 20 years younger than him. So when he dies, and I'm not wishing it, when he passes on, is that white woman going to come help the hood with that money? Of course not. Marriage is about business. And that's why white women only marry black men who got something going for themselves, because they know it's about economics. And they know in the natural order of things, he's going to leave the earth before she does. And the sadness of interracial marriage is black men give their money to white women who already belong to a people who got it all, take it from those who need it. It's an act of treachery and it's sabotage. I don't hate white women. I respect them. I respect white men. But I am unapologetically African. I'm loyal to my people first.
Number 8. Appoint spokespersons. Control your narrative, but don't focus on criticism. Tell your truth by means of effective action.
Sometimes it seemed to me been preaching hate to meet hate.
I don't advocate any kind of hate.
But there's a lot of talk that sounds very much like it.
No, I think that the guilt complex of the American white man is so profound until when you begin to analyze the real condition of the black man in America, instead of the American white man eliminating the causes that create that condition, he tries to cover it up by accusing his accusers of teaching hate. But actually, they're just exposing him for being responsible for what exists.
Monitor your progress as you become the blueprint to black liberation.
Again, we don't have a shared collective consciousness. That's another big problem for us. Every other cultural group has a shared collective consciousness. And by shared collective consciousness, I'm not trying to insinuate that they are utopic. Chinese fight amongst each other. Arabs fight amongst each other. East Indians fight amongst each other. Latinos, Mexicans, Native Americans, Anglo-Saxons, European Jews, they fight amongst each other. But they do have a shared collective consciousness, so that there's certain core ideas and certain core beliefs that they all practice despite the disagreements that they have, which at the end of the day serves as a platform with which they can work with each other. We do not have a shared set of values. Our religious values were all over the place. Culturally, we're all over the place. Politically, we're all over the place. Economically, we're all over the place. So it's hard to organize black folk because you don't have any common denominator. And the one common denominator that you do have, which is the oppression on the negative side and the shared cultural heritage on the other side, that doesn't even serve as a common denominator, because you have too many black people who are trying to claim that they are not black. And you have too many black people who are trying to disqualify the impact and role that the legacy of slavery continues to have in the life of black folks. So it is very difficult to bring together people who actually don't want to be together, wish they were never black in the first place, and who definitely are not looking at investing in one another. Here's what we have to do. We have to find those who do care. You have to go on a search mission, a reconnaissance mission, to find those who have not been destroyed by the psychological Holocaust. We are in the middle of a psychological Holocaust, and I believe we're at the beginning of a 21st century Holocaust. Kill the thought process that keeps black people together, and then ultimately kill the black people.